So I think where I'm maybe going to start, given Thomas, that you are one of the people who is maybe a little bit more familiar with some of the people at Inscape, I'm hoping that the first thing we can talk a little bit about is how we actually got into the industry. And maybe before I pass it over to you, I'll just let everyone know listening in. If you do have a question, if there is something that you think we might talk about, please just drop your question, drop your thought in the chat. I do have an eye on it, and where it's sort of relevant, I will bring your question into the conversation, so you can think about me as your voice in this conversation. So maybe to start off with, I'm hoping we can talk a little bit first about how each one of us got into the industry, and maybe we can start with Thomas. Can you give us a little bit of an idea of where you were before you got into the design space, and then what it was like for you making a little bit of a shift getting into this industry?
For sure. Thank you, Alfie, as well. So my journey into UX was not a direct journey, as I think many of us have also experienced. I studied a degree called Information Design at the University of Pretoria, and it was a very wide kind of catch-all design degree that exposed you to illustration and branding and book design and basically every aspect of design, UX being one of them. And I graduated from that degree during one of the COVID years. And needless to say, I was a little bit burnt out and dealing with a bit of an identity crisis. So I ended up falling around doing some freelance illustration and lecturing on the side. And I didn't have a clear idea of where I wanted to go. Near the end of that year, a friend of mine, a good friend of mine, told me about a UX grad program, and it sounded very exciting. So I decided to take the leap, apply, and I got in. And it wasn't a decision I'd made that I was going to go into UX now, but once I got there, it just felt like I was made for this industry. Initially, I was very nervous about being in a place that was slightly less creative. Not to say that UX isn't creative, but I don't believe that creativity is the core aspect or principle of UX necessarily. But I found that being in a space that's more focused on solving problems scratches an itch that needs to be scratched for me. And it's actually enabled me to save my creative energy more for my personal endeavors that I can live out in my personal life. So yeah, that's how I got here.
And thanks so much. And I'm definitely hoping that we can touch a little bit more on that sort of perspective. I think that a lot of people have about needing to have this like deep creative drive to be able to enter the UX space. But maybe before we do that, Bongani, I'll pass the mic over onto you. It'll be good to hear a little bit about your experience, both before getting into the UX and product design space, where you were, and kind of how you made the transition into this industry.
No, thanks, Harvey. From my side, it's a long story, but I'll try to cut it a bit shorter. So from my side, when I was in high school, I usually used to hustle for side money. So I used to do like a bit of posters on the side, a bit of business cards there. In my world, I thought that was design, right? That was the core thing that design was. And then I was lucky enough out of high school to actually be hired by a company called Bsoft, where I actually did content administration there, and then also slash a bit of design there. I was lucky enough to actually work for a company called propelled, which is now rebranded to be Helm. So what I did there while I was loading content is I spent more time just actually interning in the studio, going there, seeing what they were doing. I actually liked the vibe. It was basically the vibe that drove me to that space. They always had like music in the background. They always had like these posters, these papers everywhere. There were crayons, there were pencils. There was quite a lot of stuff that was fun about that space. So I spent most of my time there. So learning from them, actually learning a bit about design. They gave me books to do, tutorials to do. I gave me tasks to actually assemble and do. And then later on that stage, I was like, okay, cool. I like this thing. This thing sounds good. So I I studied actually graphic design, and then changed from a graphic designer to an interaction designer. Did that for a couple of years, and then I actually I've got a chance to actually do a bit of user testing. User testing was a different ball game. It was a lot of driven, what's this? I would say data driven decision and on all of that. So I started falling in love with that. And then what I saw was slightly different from the normal design that I was drawn to. But the thing that I liked the most is every decision that they made was, number one, led by the users, the research and all of that. And then they validated their assumptions quite a lot. And then I was like to myself, I want to do this. So I started doing that quite a bit. And then I felt like there was still a need for me to actually get that insights, that theory and all of that. So I went to Inscape to actually get that. Because I'm one person who actually struggles with articulating my ideas or motivating for something. So through Inscape, I learned how to do that. I learned how to articulate myself better, learned how to motivate for things. And then, now and then I started growing in the UX space. So it's kind of like different codes every time. I change so many codes within the industry, and then UX is the one where I feel at home. Yeah, pretty much.
Wonderful. And I hope we can also dive in a little bit more into your experience. I think a lot of people kind of have this idea of the UX or the design team is like the creative space among all of the other, standard
Spaces.
office environments.
Exactly.
And I think that's one of the things that definitely, separates us creative people, you might say, from the rest.
Makes
And
sense,
I think one of the things that's similar in my own personal story to yours is like this sort of thing of doing business cards and a little bit of creative work in your own space in order to first build up a little bit of a portfolio and kind of get used to the creative aspect, and then later on pivoting fully into the design industry. But I think our final guest for today has a little bit of a different experience. I think for the three of us, like each of us started in our experience in education. We were already veering towards UX, even if it was unknowingly, and then sort of got in. But Mikara, your experience was a little bit different to the rest of ours. Do you mind sharing a little bit of how you got into the industry?
So yeah, I did have a slightly different experience. I've lived an entire kind of lifetime before as an architect. So I kind of did the whole journey, and then I practiced for almost 8 years. And I really liked what I was doing. So I wasn't actually searching for anything else at that point. And I did architecture and then urban design. And if you know anything about those two spaces, the urban design really looks at how, different, you could call them systems, integrate with each other, how different town planning regulations and policies and all those things need to work together. So I was always slightly less interested in what the building looked like, and I was more interested in how things kind of fitted together in a kind of more macro scale. My husband he's still my husband, but my husband at that time, he went through a transition of going from advertising into UX, and he sort of saw what was going on in the UX space, and he was like, "Oh, Mikara, this is so interesting." I was being kind of supportive, so I was like, "Oh, I'll come to all the meetups with you, like no problem. I'm the more social one of the two of us, happy to just kind of tag along." And through going through that process, I learned about service design, which is not UX per se, it's in the experience realm, but about service design, which is very much that kind of systems thinking view on how to solve problems in the more digital space or product space. And I fell in love with the idea. I then started just researching. I was very lucky to then have been able to meet someone who kind of, I think it just happened kind of naturally, was kind of my mentor in that space, who had also come from a previous architecture background. And kind of one thing led to the next. He mentored me, and I had 6 months of that before he sort of said, "Oh, do you want a job now?" So it was a very, very interesting experience, and I probably should caveat that it was a slightly different time. This all happened just pre-COVID. That kind of transition happened just pre-COVID, and it's been very fulfilling in the spaces that I needed to still, the itch that I was trying to scratch as well in the architecture space. It's been doing the same thing. I often equate some of the role players in the architecture space, whether they're the developer or the engineer, to the people that we're actually engaging with in UX. We've got developers and engineers, and they're surprisingly fulfilling very similar roles and have very similar pain points. And we're just talking about different end products, which I found really, really, really interesting. The transferability of the skill set has been surprisingly easy, or easier than I had expected. And I completely agree with the previous speakers that it's been less about the creativeness and more about your problem solving ability and your ability to build relationships and your ability to communicate. more than anything else. So yeah, that's been my journey.
Wonderful. Yeah. And I think, especially your journey is relevant to the conversation today, because I think there are many people who've built a career in one or other space. And because of the changing times, both in terms of the tech shift the world has kind of gone through post-COVID, a lot of people are considering making a little bit of a shift out of their current career, current space, and they're looking at how they might enter the tech landscape. And I think especially for those who are a little bit less math oriented and a little bit more on the empathetic side, UX is a great space to sort of look into. But then I think there's a whole swath of other people who are like, UX, what is that? So firstly, I will say that stands for user experience design. But I'm hoping that you, as our guests and our specialists for today, can help give us a little bit more of a view of what that actually is and what that actually means. So I'm going to drop our next question in the chat as well for anyone who's listening along with us. But what I'm hoping we can talk a little bit about is what exactly is the role of a UX designer. Now, I know our roles and titles don't actually say UX design. So I'm sort of going to broaden it a little bit to the role of design in a tech company. And so I'd love to hear a little bit from each one of you. What exactly, in your definition, in your experience, the role of a UX designer is in a team? Specifically, what that team looks like, what it's responsible for in the wider organization, and your own personal experience of that. And I'm not sure if I should suggest if someone would like to go first, or I can volunteer.
I can go.
I don't know. Do you have some thoughts, please?
From my side, I'll just say for what it is, UX is basically user experience design. So for me, how I look at it is actually designing the experience that the customer actually receives, right? This could be in a digital platform. It could be a normal product. It could be you using a tab, you going to an elevator, you using an app, you using a website. So that's basically how the user goes through that experience. The nice thing about user experience is, or UX design in this case, it's very user focused or user centric. So we use user centric design, making everything focused on the user. In terms of what I would say is our daily task or the stuff that we do, number one is I tend to say we advocate for users, number one. But the things that we do a lot is research. So doing competitor analysis, doing research about the product that we're working for, unpacking things, maybe a brief, maybe a discussion, maybe anything. So we unpack things. The most chunk of our things is we have to validate our assumptions, right? So when you build a product, you have assumptions, you've gotten something from business, you've gotten something from a client. So now you actually want to see if that thing is indeed needed in the market. So I would say it's basically validating our assumptions. How we do that is by user testing. What will be responsible for this is coming up with the script itself, also testing the product itself, and then taking those insights and then actually gathering it into the design process. But in the design scale, we also do wireframing, essentially looking at how the thing would look like, doing task flows, which is just the basic form of how the user would move from one space to another. We do low fidelity wireframes, high fidelity wireframes, and then leads to the actual visual design that the people see on a day-to-day basis. But the part that I'm actually very interested in mostly and spending my time in is basically accessibility at the moment, right? So is the thing accessible? Mm-hmm. Can everyone use it? So if people with disabilities, people who are colorblind, can they actually use the product? So that's the space that I'm really, really much leaning into in these days. So yeah, but in a nutshell, that's basically what we do. I'll just let the other team also just mention some stuff as well.
Thomas, I don't know if you'd like to share a little bit from your side. What would you say the role of a UX designer is, especially in a team? And your answer might be a little bit different because I know things change from team to team, from organization to organization.
Yeah, for sure. So, Bongani, I think what you mentioned is definitely the North Star for what UX design should be and what it is like at its core. Centering the user and always advocating for them. But I think what's been interesting in my experience, and I think in many of our experiences, is that the people you work with or work under or are in the organization do not necessarily share that sentiment. So that goal of catering and advocating for the user is sometimes something that you are working towards, but you have to kind of come up with another way to get there in these situations. So I think for me, one of the other things that I feel like has been my role is to be support in my teams. A lot of my experiences have been in immature UX environments where there is no formal team structure for UX. There's no research department versus a testing department versus a UI department. I've been that department in some instances all by myself. And there's a lot of people who don't understand, what UX is and don't see the value of it. So I've had to be very clever about how to advocate for the user, but still, appease business and help them. But ultimately, I'm trying to help the user. So I think for me, in my experience, the role of a UX designer has been to be very adaptable and to kind of always be looking for ways to get things done. I feel like we are problem solvers by nature, and you have to be flexible and adaptable. I think that's like a core aspect and role for a UX designer.
That's absolutely fantastic and so true. You can very easily fall prey to this trap of like experiencing the ideal version of what it should be when you're sort of starting off in your career, and most of what you've seen are these beautiful designs or these super tailored marketing like people post about their design teams, and then when you get to the reality of working in a team and it's like business is like, yes, we care about the user, but what's the bottom line? And it's kind of like your responsibility to manage those two extremes. With Makari, it'd be interesting to hear a little bit from your side. What would you say is the role of a UX designer in a team? And especially if, I don't know if you'll manage, but if you can also relate that to how it's changed from what your role as an architect was, and are there any sort of parallels in that?
Yeah, similar roles, I would say, in some way or form. But I was having a bit of a chuckle now because I think what you said, Thomas, about kind of you're a party of one, being able to try and do as many things as possible, I think is the experience of many UX designers or people in this kind of sphere. What I would say about my kind of experience or of what a UX designer would be is definitely somebody who's a connector. So problem solver for sure, but like a connector of people, of ideas. So almost always being able to see things that are happening in and amongst various parts. What I've found in all the organizations I've worked in is that there is always the bottom line that we're trying to achieve. And to ladder that up, you've got your KPIs and your OKRs. And so what ends up happening, not because of anybody's fault, is that people begin to work very much in silos. So as a result, the interesting role that I think design in general has been able to play quite successfully has been to connect things that they're seeing, because everybody can see these patterns, but nobody's focusing on them because they've got their own sort of goals and objectives to meet. And I think the openness that comes with sort of being able to spot the patterns and pull them all together is probably where design has most value and has kind of had most value over the last 3 years. But that has shifted and kind of morphed, I think, over the even 4 years or 5 years that I've been doing this. And that I think is because the landscape has changed in terms of the demand, in terms of the expectations, in terms of skill sets of existing teams. All those things have begun to shift and morph. And so as a result, you've kind of got a different landscape every day. So if I think about the underlying thing, it's always being a connector, but pulling the conversations together and then being some sort of problem solver. And though that might seem quite vague, it then does take the form of these multiple roles where you kind of do what you need to do. I'd say also, sorry, I'm talking quite a bit, but I'd say one other thing is also just what has been of probably most value to me at the moment is like how you're bringing business value to the user value. And users might not be end users might be employees who use a tool. So how is making that experience better, not just for the user, but then for everybody who's along that chain? And that I think is also part of. Alfie, do you want me to still answer the other question? I think I've spoken a lot.
There is actually maybe something instead that I would like you briefly to talk talk to before we move on to the next step, because I think your title is slightly different from the rest of the crew, and I know there are many people who are even in the UX design space that are not necessarily familiar with what service design is. Now, I'm not going to make you explain all of what service design is, but maybe what might be interesting to hear is what would you say is the difference between the typical UX designer or the typical role compared to the responsibilities of a service designer?
So I'll keep it quite short, but I think service designer is kind of what the word sort of says. So you are designing services, and services, unlike the end kind of user experience, will touch on multiple things along a journey of a customer. So the easiest way I think like to almost visualize it is that you've got a series of the front end things that maybe a customer would see or an employee would see, and then there's a series of supporting things that needs to happen in the background, often whether that's a bunch of people who need to do things or a bunch of processes that need to happen, and looking at that entire ecosystem for optimization, for getting the user obviously, their goals met, but also making some sort of business value and being able to advocate for where future trajectories need to go. It's almost seeing that full sort of picture, and then designing that service as a whole.
So we've heard a little bit about, this idea of being able to put together low fidelity wireframes and high fidelity wireframes from Bongani, and the importance of user testing. Thomas, you spoke a little bit more about being able to manage or balance these two extremes of business value versus user value. And then Mikara, you kind of summed it up of this idea of being a connector and bringing things that are seemingly disparate or seemingly siloed into one sort of connected, unified whole. And I think that touches on a lot of what a user experience designer is, from the artifacts that we actually develop and deploy to the relationships and communication that we enable. And so I'd like to maybe get a little bit more personal on what each one of you think is the unique superpower or thing that you bring to the table. And I'll maybe start with myself. I would definitely say, though it's not technically a part of the designer's role, I think one of the superpowers I've always brought to the table is enabling firstly is making connections. I think one of the things you spoke about is being able to bring people together, especially when they kind of find themselves in silos. But I think my sociability, so for those of you who would know me, I'm an extreme extrovert, and I found that actually can help quite a bit in the design space. And so one of my superpowers, which is unrelated to the actual aesthetics of the job, is being able to actually connect with very different people. And so maybe let's go around the room, starting with you, Thomas. What would you say your superpower is as a designer?
Cool. So I think for me, what I would say is the ability to overcome uncertainty. And it's something that, took a while for me to realize how impactful it was. But early on in my career, I was dropped onto a client with very little support and very little structure, in a completely unfamiliar domain. It was in the financial space, and I'm not a very financial person or financially knowledgeable person. No structure, no team, no knowledge. And it was very confusing. I was very lost. And every single day I was faced with all these unknowns that were affecting my personhood, my confidence, and what am I doing here? I don't know if I can do this. But then at some stage in that process, in those days, it kind of clicked into place for me. And I started to realize that all these uncertainties don't have to cause me anxiety. They don't have to be bad things. And I started to see them as opportunities. And now I feel like when I'm in an environment or situation that's uncertain, it no longer, upsets me. I feel like I can weather the storm. I can look at it and I can start unpacking that uncertainty. I can say, okay, cool. How can I break this down? How can I get to that point of certainty? And that's been immensely powerful, and it's helped me in every aspect of my career.
Yeah, and I think it's especially people in more technical and structured aspects that collaborate with designers. It's a trait that's highly valued. Bongani, what about you? On your side, what do you think your superpower is?
From my side, I just want to actually applaud Thomas. What he has, the adaptability part is very, very needed in the design space. You'll never know what type of role you'll be playing, what type of team you'll be working in. So that adaptability goes a long way. I think it's one of the skills that every designer should have. Yeah, you'll find yourself in open waters and be like, why? What am I doing here? Why did I sign up for this? So I think Thomas has a very good skill there. And from my side, I think for me, I would say my superpower is I'm a conversation starter, and also kind of like a discussion facilitator. It's a weird one because I'm super introverted, so I spend most of my time by myself. I'm a lone wolf, so but it's weird when it comes to work. Is I'm good at starting conversations, right? What I mean by that is when you find yourself when you're working with big teams or big teams, I've been lucky enough to actually work in a space where there's like diverse people and diverse stakeholders and all of that. You'll find that there's always that bridge whereby they can't, how may I put it? Everyone has these great ideas, but putting them in a conversation or in a tangible thing that they can actually talk about or elaborate is actually quite hard. So the good thing about my side is basically I'll listen to what everyone is talking about. We call them mini working session. Try and map up that thing in a design format. Maybe it could be like very basic wireframe, very terrible thing. But that thing will spark conversations, right? Basically, it will spark people seeing ideas, pouring out ideas in that space. Another thing that I've noticed in that space is different departments or different disciplines tend to fear speaking to other disciplines. Maybe that person is too high up in the industry, or maybe that person is like a CEO or that high person. So they'll find it harder to ask those weird questions. The reason why I say I'm a facilitator, a facilitator is I don't mind being wrong. I'll throw my idea out there, get shanked for it. But the nice thing is, after getting shanked for it, we'll come up with multiple ideas and then we can move forward. So today might be a bad day for me if you look at it, but I don't take it as a bad day. I take it as ideas have been generated. Tomorrow when I show up, there's a lot more enthusiasm and then we are going in the right direction. So conversation starter and a discussion facilitator. Yeah,
such a good point, and especially that last bit you talked about being willing and able to be wrong without taking it to heart too deeply is such an important point, because more often than not, multiple people have that question and are not like, they don't want to seem like the person who doesn't know what's going on. And so it is good as a designer to just be willing to put up your hand and maybe look a little bit silly for a few seconds, but then actually get it out there on the table. Mikara, I'd love to hear from you as well.
So I really love both of these answers, and Bongani sparked something for me. This was not my original answer, but I'll share this anyway. So this is like, I wouldn't say it's a superpower, but it's definitely like a value that I've lived by. In architecture, I had a lecturer who used to say, no work, no crit. So if you don't have work, you can't get a crit, and without a crit, you can't move forward. And I remember once I got shouted at for it because I came with no work, and that's sort of the repercussions of that sort of like stayed with me. And so now I use that in my every single kind of day. And I do feel like that's actually been really valuable. Like, even if it's like the tiniest bit of work, like just being able to show something, not that I've done it, show a picture, show of something on the screen, evokes such a different conversation to just talking about ideas in a sort of like vacuum. So that would definitely be the one. And then I think all of you guys have touched on it in different ways, but I'd say mine is curiosity. Like, I'm deeply, deeply curious. And I also think that I'm in awe of a lot of things. Despite how long I've kind of been in the industry, like, I still think things are amazing, or I find things interesting. And so that genuine curiosity, I think, allows people to feel sort of safe and open to share. And that definitely opens up different kinds of conversations, which maybe don't happen that often. So that would be what I'd say.
And I think that, that curiosity, and you are right. I think each one of the things that we've shared now all touches on this idea of curiosity and an openness to possibility. And it's one of the huge things that designers play, because, our contribution and our role is very much at the beginning of in the first or earlier phases of the process of a product or experience being developed. So the next thing I'd like us to talk a little bit about is a question from one of our audience members, Rudolph. And I think it's such a good point. And essentially what he was asking is, like, what are some of the telltale signs or some of the things to look out for when you're an aspiring UX designer or someone looking to enter the space, about like that might point to the design maturity of a company? Like, how do you know when a company is familiar with UX design and its requirements and needs versus some of the companies that might be a little bit newer to it. So, if you did have to give a little bit of advice to somebody who maybe is in the stage of applying for jobs and interviewing at all kinds of companies, what are some of the things that they might look out for some of the companies that are a little bit more mature in the UX space? I'll maybe open this up to anyone who'd like to give it a shot.
I can. Oh, go for it, Thomas.
I'll keep it short. I think there's the obvious signs. If there's like a fully fledged product team or even multiple teams, who have distinct responsibilities, who handle different aspects of product development, that's a sign that there is a level of maturity, although that can also sometimes not mean they're as mature as they appear. It can also, a more mature space might have a more defined design methodology, whether it's design thinking or the double diamond. It can even be as granular as having structures or templates for the way they do work and conduct their work. Actually having templates for an ideation session or templates for creating wireframes, down to standards for how they structure their files. I think those are some signs you could look out for.
Mm-hmm. Mikara?
Yeah. I would probably add to that. Like, I also think that some of those things will come through in like the conversation. So by asking questions like about how, they perceive roles, and how organizations are, would define their UX trajectory in the next 5 years, or where they see the future of UX, or where they see the future of their organization's user experience going. Like almost prying questions from the other side, I think is also really useful. I also think that, like, I don't know, like I feel like sometimes UX, like the maturity of an organization's thinking about user problems versus them having all the infrastructure to implement it might not always be matching. So sometimes the intentions could be really strong to say, hey, we really want to put the user first. Maybe we're a startup. Maybe we don't have all the funding to do all the things, but we want to help. We want you to help us grow and build to that. I think that I would then consider that still sort of mature in a way, because the thinking is probably the hardest thing to get right, or the mindset around it. So that would be the one thing I would say. And then the other thing I would say is, like, you mistrust your gut a lot when it comes to those kinds of conversations. You'll know if it feels mature or not. Yeah, that's the other thing I'd say.
From my side, also, Alfie, you can go. From my side, I would say there's two ways to look at it. From my side is, number one, stalk them. There's nothing. Stalking could work. I know it's usually used for paid purposes, but stalk a company, right? One thing that I like is that they say good design is invincible, or is it seamless, right? So go to their website, see the stuff that they've done. If you see a similar product or something that they've done that is very good, and that you used it and the experience was amazing, it means that team actually values user experience design, right? Another thing is what Thomas touched on is actually just go and see what type of methodologies that they use, right? So read some of their case studies, so see how they actually solved their problems and see how they actually have done the stuff that they've done. And then the other one for me is, sorry, I've now lost my train of thought, but it was the stalking part. And then the other one is look at their team. The team is very important. So I like the fact that LinkedIn has now given us a network to actually connect with one another and see who works for that company there. Look at the people that are familiar. Look at the stuff that they've done. Look at some of the discussions that they've done. I for my side, watch Alfie's channel. So I tend to know a few people that are there, and I look out for those people in that organization, because I know as designers, we all strive for a great experience. So if you see a familiar face, you know that, okay, cool, this person also advocates for what I advocate for. So you know that this company is UX, how may I put it, is mature enough on a UX space.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point. And I'll maybe just add on to what you were saying there, is like looking through networks and talking to other people. The thing you're mentioning about maybe going stalking their LinkedIn, seeing what some of the work that they've done. But I think, you could even see if you can start up a chat with somebody who has worked there or who has come in contact with that company to hear a little bit, because you'd be surprised how willing people might be to just answer a quick LinkedIn message. You could just open up a LinkedIn chat and be like, hey, I'm thinking about interviewing at ABC company. I'd just like to know from your perspective, how mature do you think this company is in terms of UX? Now, if the person is currently working there, they might have a little bit of a biased answer. So it might be useful to find someone who has either acted as a service provider for them. Maybe they're an outside agency or a development house that has worked with the company, or it might be somebody who used to work there that has since moved on. That might be a great way that you might be able to do that. And I'll maybe pass it back to you, Bongani. One of the other questions that I did see here that I think you might be able to talk a little bit to, given your experience, is just highlighting the difference between the role of a graphic designer versus the role of a UX designer. And you can talk about that in the practical perspective. What are the types of work that you do? But maybe you can also talk about that as at the higher level perspective of, like, from a conceptual standpoint, what are their responsibilities? Feel free to take it in either direction.
That's a hard question. I'll try my best. I think I might simplify it way too much for the person. But graphic design, for me, I take it as focusing mainly on the vector side of things, right? So that's actually creating certain artifacts, looking at logos, brand guidelines, kind of like the visual experience of a brand. So style guides, rules, basically just graphic elements of that space. Whereas UX design is broad, right? UX design is looking at the experience of that part. We don't usually touch too much on the vector sides of things. We look at how the experiences go from one space to the next. I'm not going to go too much into it because I know I'm very bad at explaining these things, but they're very different from one another. And from what I've noticed is when I was doing graphic design, I spent most of my time in Illustrator and in Photoshop. And then when I moved into UX design, I barely touch Illustrator. I barely touch Photoshop. It's usually different artifacts. It's Figma, it's Excel spreadsheets. It's quite a lot of stuff that is different. So the space, in terms of the user base that you're working for, are very different from one another. But I'll allow Thomas and Makira to also help me in that space, just to differentiate the two.
I don't know if you've got something to share, because Makara, I do have a little bit of a different question for you.
Sure. So I think, as I mentioned previously, I came from a more like design background, non-UX design background. And when I did come into UX design, similar to what Makara mentioned, I noticed a lot of my skills transferring really well, and it kind of helped me to get like a jump start in the UX space. And I think if you come from a graphic design background where the focus is on, creating visuals that are visually balanced and appealing and pleasing to the eye, those skills can kind of manifest in the UX space in the form of creating UIs, in the form of creating layouts and structure on a page that is appealing and balanced. But it's not a one-to-one transfer. It's not the exact same, because you're not necessarily going to be, creating a brand, on this screen you're working on. But there definitely is overlap. I think the ultimate goal of UX is always going to be, though, to create something that serves a purpose and helps someone do a task, whereas graphic design is more about creating a visual that communicates an idea, I would say.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a very succinct way to put it. As a graphic designer, you're responsible for the way a thing looks and its ability to communicate an idea, versus the UX designer focuses on still the way a thing looks, but more how it helps you achieve a task.
Yes, definitely.
And so, Makara, I think one of the things I would like you to talk a little bit about, especially given your background before entering the design space and some of the work that you do now, is I think there are a lot of people, especially if you're maybe coming from the ideation space, because I know that's one of these aspects that you can study at Inscape. But you might be coming from something like architecture, you might be coming from something like engineering, where you haven't had this training in the more aesthetic part. If you've had a background in graphic design and that you're entering UX, you're kind of more learning how to solve problems that help a person achieve a task. But there's this sort of concern or this uncertainty, like if you're not a very aesthetic person and you didn't come from a very aesthetically creative background, is that a problem, or is there a space for you in the design industry or the UX industry if you're a little bit less on the aesthetic side of things?
I mean, I would say definitely. In fact, I wouldn't personally see it as a prerequisite because I've, in my time kind of working in the UX space, haven't used too much of the kind of, I mean, I do know how to use Photoshop and Illustrator and stuff. I used to use that in architecture, but I haven't actually used it in the current environments that I work in. I think the real skill set comes in being able to communicate ideas. And I think you can do that in so many different ways, whether that's through just being able to map something out in a way that explains it in a succinct way, whether that is, it might even come down to an Excel spreadsheet. God knows I'm not a huge fan, but there's so many different ways to communicate information succinctly, and that needs to be directed to the audience that you're engaging. Most of those audiences are not looking for a graphic, a super beautiful graphic medium. They're looking for clear information displayed in a way that makes sense to them. To be very honest, a lot of the work that I end up doing works largely in like programs like Miro, Figma, if we want to do like sort of quick prototypes, lots of like research tools. So at the moment I'm using a tool called Dovetail, which is helping to just analyze data, and then definitely like, PowerPoints and the really fun stuff, the really fun stuff. But, again, a PowerPoint, if you look at the purpose of a PowerPoint, it's being able to communicate information in a really succinct way. So if you can do it with the kind of standard icons and those kinds of things, and it does the job, that's more than, that's more.
Thomas, or Bongani, if either of you would like to add on to this, I'll give you a chance now. But I think maybe one thing I'll just add on to what you're saying, Makara, to give it a little bit broader of context, is I think the concern that as a UX designer you need to have this strong aesthetic base usually comes from not having a clear idea, which is understandable, of what the role of a UX designer looks like. But if we take some of the insights that we've discussed so far, this idea of connecting people, this idea of facilitating conversations, the idea of bringing different silos together, none of those activities actually require any sort of aesthetic ability. Instead, what they require is for you to really distill complexity and represent that in some kind of artifact, which you can have a conversation around. Whether, as you mentioned, that is, a flow diagram in Miro, whether that is a PowerPoint presentation that turns a huge number of Excel spreadsheets into a succinct presentation. Your role really is to facilitate that kind of conversation using different visual artifacts. And so I think that's such a great point. So Thomas or Bongani, I don't know if either of you have anything to add on to that, or if we should move on to our next question.
I think from my side, I'll just add on top of that, but I do agree with what you guys have said. I don't think for me as a UX designer, you need that to be that visually aesthetic a designer. The reason why I say that is you can actually specialize in UX design in a specific field if you want as well. You could be a dedicated researcher, UX researcher, and that's all that you do. But you can also be a jack of all trade and actually use the different skill sets that you have. But one thing that I've noticed is, number one, I don't think it's that strong because there's always, I'll speak from my side, right? There's always someone who's better at that skill than you, right? So basically what we do is you have to have that balance to actually know when to let go. So do your part, do that UX part that you have done, and let the other person who facilitates or who's better at that skill to actually take over and do the job for you, right? Number one, they are more capable of doing it than you. And number two, that's their role. So don't try and also just try and do all the roles by yourself. I know usually we do that as UX designers based on the space that you are. But if you have someone there, lean on someone to help you with that visually aesthetic part. Basically, that's what I'm saying. Yeah, but you don't need to have that one.
Very pleased.
If I can just add one more egg to this basket. I think another misconception about UX is that we see projects on Dribbble and Behance, and we have this idea that like being a UX designer or product designer is just making these like beautiful websites with these animations, and it's all just beautiful. But in my experience, I've spent a lot of time working on internal tools. So tools that I designed for people within the organization to use, and these tools have had thousands of users. And they consist mostly of tables and input fields and very basic things that allow people to conduct their work. It's not an app with beautiful illustrations and these crazy animations. It's a tool. So I just kind of want to hammer on that point as well, is that it's not just the stuff you see online or the apps you have on your phone or the games you have on your phone. There's a side of UX where aesthetics really are like on the lowest rung of importance. And it might sound boring, but I assure you it's actually a very liberating environment to work in as well, because it strips away all the noise and you can truly focus on clarity and balance. And it can be very cool, even if you're just working with tables the whole day. But yeah.
True. I think every designer at some point in their career is going to be forced into the Excel black hole.
Yeah.
At some point.
Exactly.
So maybe the last audience question for us to dive into before we get into the closing round of this conversation. We had a question from Ingrid, and she mentioned the fact that she's a graphic design student at the moment, looking to transition into UX design. And a question is about what the essential elements are to incorporate into your portfolio if you're looking to enter into the UX space. Because there's always this sort of balancing act that you're trying to do in your portfolio of showing like things that look really amazing, as well as talking about how you got to the thing. So it'd be interesting to hear from each one of you what you think is essential to include in a UX portfolio.
I can go on my side. I think for
Please.
me, one thing that I look forward to as from a UX for anyone who's in the UX space is how you solved your problem. That's basically the first thing I look into. Number one, if you can articulate the problem first, what were you trying to solve? What were the concerns from a business standpoint of whatever idea you were working on, and how you got there, right? If you show me a final product, number one, I don't know who worked on it. I don't know what parts did you touch on while you were working on that thing. And then basically, I don't know how you got to that point. So we want to know the journey. So what did you do to actually get there? Show us your sketches, your wireframes, the problem that you went through. And also just touch on what you did in that specific project. Like, this is what I did. This is where the other teams helped me. And then the last part from my side of just your learning. So for outside of all these things that you have done, what did you learn throughout this experience? And has it made you a better designer? Has it made you a slightly different designer? I want to know the learnings from that experience.
Mikara, you had started there as well.
When I moved into architecture, from architecture into service design, I got the advice because I obviously didn't have a portfolio of any UX related work. So I was like, well, what do I do now? I have all this work in architecture and I have no way to translate it. What do I do? And I remember the advice that I'd gotten was go back to the process that you had kind of followed as an architect and map that out, like in the most simple way. Map out the process that you actually followed. What were the things that you did? Who were the key stakeholders that you had to engage with? And by being able to see that process in a really, really kind of finite way, it made it clear what the kind of somebody observing my portfolio was interested in. It was not the typical sort of, this is what I created, this is the end product, but it's really like, this is the process I went through, this is how I did it, this is why I made the decisions that I made, and this is the end result. I think the other thing that was a mindset shift for me from architecture to here was that it didn't have to have like done well. You didn't have to have had the building, do great things or look really beautiful. It was like, well, even if it failed, what did you learn? Like, what was I think Bongani, you said the similar thing, like, even if it wasn't great, like, it doesn't matter. That doesn't mean that that's not a project you put into your portfolio. It means it's probably a project you should put into your portfolio because it enables you to talk about things because you learn the most from kind of failing in a process. So that gives you so much ammunition to be able to sort of speak about what process you would have done differently. And yeah, I think keeping it as simple and sort of graphic as possible with like, it should be quite punchy and easy to digest and like not overwhelming, like definitely not more than 5 I think is still even too much, but having more than 5 projects I think is just obscene. It's just too many things for anybody on the other side to receive it. So yeah, just in terms of size, in terms of the key things and the spectrum that it should kind of fit across.
Thomas?
I also just want to jump in there. I think Bongani and Makara 100% agree from my side. I think those are the most important thing. I think I just want to add maybe a cautionary piece of advice. A lot of juniors who are straight out of university, they've just been exposed to these methodologies like design thinking, And I think when you are studying and you're being exposed to these methodologies, it's kind of just about coming to grips with it, understanding the different parts of it, and knowing what those steps are and what deliverables link to what step. But I think when you are trying to get into the industry, what's more valuable than just showing that you know what design thinking is and what the steps are, it's actually showing your thinking, and showing why you made the decisions you made. I think if you look on Behance and these platforms, you see a lot of, once again, beautiful UX portfolios or UX projects and case studies. And they have like this long list of deliverables, personas, and stakeholder maps and feature maps and all these things. But when I read those, a lot of the times there's a disconnect between those deliverables. It doesn't feel like they're building onto each other. It feels like this designer was given a checklist, like on a university project, you have to submit these things, and then they've just like checked those boxes. The point of a case study, fundamentally, in my opinion, is to show your thinking, to show how you took a problem and how you, through a process, whether that be design thinking or whatever, how you went from that problem space and came up with a solution that was relevant, or that worked or didn't work. But yeah, thinking, it's not about checking the list of I have a persona and this and this and this.
Mm-hmm. I think that's such a great point, and I think each of us sort of touched on a specifically important part. But there are two things that I wanna highlight that were mentioned. The first was from Makara. More than 5 things in a UX portfolio is probably overdoing it. And you can even get away with 2, for example, especially if they're well crafted and they both illustrate your thinking in a different way. And the other one, Thomas, that you mentioned is being able to actually show your thinking and to do so in a way that makes sense from a narrative perspective. Because also, the one thing that I will just really push on is that people who do the hiring are going through like 50, 100 different portfolios. So they don't have that much time to spend on every single portfolio that they're going through. So it's highly important that, you're communicating as much as possible in as little space and time as possible. And that also, in some sense, your ability to do that in your portfolio also shows your ability to simplify complexity as a designer. Maybe the last thing I will do, because I see we are almost at the end of our hour, is maybe from each one of us one piece of advice. If you were to roll the clock back to right before you entered the design industry, one piece of advice that you would give yourself coming into the space. And maybe we can start with you this time, Makara.
Sure, no problem. I think what I would give myself is something that I did, I think, naturally, but now when I look back, I'm like, wow, that was like probably really, really valuable, was that curiosity sort of led me to go to different events, to meet as many people as possible, to just like put my hand up for a bunch of stuff that I didn't know I was kind of putting my hand up for at the time, because I just wanted to learn. And in hindsight, like, it was only because of that culmination of all those experiences that have enabled me to kind of see the kind of full spectrum of the kind of work I was doing and also the work I wanted to do. So that would be the advice I would give myself, and I was lucky that I took it without knowing.
Bongani, on your side?
From my side, I would just say that the one thing that I would teach myself is never leave things to the last moment. One thing we tend to do is you are afraid to actually ask for feedback and critical thinking. So you do this work, and then at 4 o'clock, when you need to go home at 5, it's when you show your work, and then they just basically just rip apart your entire screens, right? And give you feedback, and then you start again tomorrow. So never leave things to the last moment. It could be a deadline. It could be the screens for revision. And then always ask for help, and then to say no. One of the things that designers tend to do is we are afraid to say no. So you end up getting too many requests or stuff that you need to do, these presentations, all of these things that you need to do, and then you never say no. So learn to say no and don't leave things to the last moment.
Great. I think I could even take that advice. Thomas, your side?
Cool. So I think when I was at university, I had this lecturer, this illustration lecturer, and one of the things she always told us was to talk to yourself as you were drawing. So say now you sit down and you were supposed to draw a person, you speak to yourself internally, you say, what is the biggest shape that I'm seeing? Is it an oval? Is it a rectangle? What is it? Okay, it's a rectangle, so I'm going to put down that rectangle. What is the second biggest shape that I'm seeing? It's the head, and the head is kind of making this S shape. And she kept on like hammering on this idea of speaking to yourself. And at the time I was like, okay, cool, I get it, but that feels a little bit excessive. But now I see the value in having that internal dialogue. I think especially like in any creative endeavor or any job, like you can think of it as a series of decisions that are being made. And by cultivating and developing your internal dialogue with yourself and talking through the decisions you are making as you are making them is such a valuable skill, and it will take your problem solving to the next level. So yeah, cultivate your inner dialogue is my piece of advice.
All fantastic advice from all of us. I think the one thing that I would definitely say, I haven't shared too much of my journey, but the piece of advice that I would give myself is bet on yourself. Like each person has got something valuable to bring to the table, and it's easy to doubt yourself when it comes time to get into that interview, to put your CV in that list. But go for it, give it a try, and you'd be surprised what will unfold from that. But I think that brings us to the closing stages of this discussion, and it feels like time has absolutely just flown by. But I just want to say thanks to Mikara, to Mungani, and to Thomas for joining us in this conversation today. And to everyone who has watched along on this stream, it's been an absolute pleasure having you, and thanks for dropping your questions. I know we didn't get to answer all of the questions, but hopefully we can, whether through social media or other avenues, sort of communicate some of those. And I'm sure Thomas Bongani and Mikara would be more than willing to connect with anyone who is interested on LinkedIn. So if you would like to maybe ask a direct question or get a little bit of advice, please do connect with them. And hopefully this is not the last time we are doing this. It's been super fun for me. I'm sure you guys have all had a great time being here. So until next time, thank you very much.
Thanks for having us. Cheers.
Thank you so much. Cheers.